Valentine's Day, the holiday most people associate with romance and roses, has an original name. It was called Lupercalia, and it was held on February 15th. Priests called Luperci sacrificed goats and a dog at the Lupercal cave, the cave where Rome believed a she-wolf had nursed Romulus and Remus. They cut strips of hide from the animals and ran through the streets of Rome. Plutarch, writing in the 1st century CE, documented what followed. Women of Rome's highest social classes deliberately walked into their path to be struck. Senators' wives, women who ran the households that ran the empire, this was scheduled. These women positioned themselves in the streets and waited because they believed it would help them conceive. Pope Gelasius I suppressed Lupercalia in 494 CE after what church records describe as a long contest. Nominally, Christian Romans had continued the ritual for generations after the empire adopted Christianity. Gelasius condemned it in writing as empty and misguided, but he did not replace it with Valentine's Day. He replaced it with Candlemas on February 2nd, the feast of the purification of the Virgin Mary. The pagan purification of women's fertility became the Christian celebration of Mary's post-childbirth purification. One meaning, two names, 1 week apart. The story that Valentine's Day was created to replace Lupercalia has no historical evidence. Modern scholars have confirmed it is a myth. The Gelasian decree, commonly cited as the source, does not mention Valentine at all. The romantic holiday appears in medieval English poetry approximately 900 years after Lupercalia was suppressed. St. Patrick's Day. Patrick was not Irish. He described himself in his own writing as a Roman captive. Around the age of 16, he was seized from his father's villa, most likely in Roman Britain, by Irish raiders and taken into slavery. He spent 6 years in Ireland as a herder. He escaped, made his way across Gaul, and eventually returned to Britain. Then he went back to Ireland voluntarily as a missionary. 2 documents survive in his own hand, the Confessio and the letter to Coroticus. Neither mentions snakes, neither mentions druids, neither describes a single miracle. The snake legend does not appear in any historical account until the 11th century, approximately 600 years after Patrick died. Ireland has not had native snakes since the last ice age ended roughly 10,000 years ago. The cold temperatures and the Irish Sea prevented snake migration long before Patrick was born. There were no snakes. The monks who wrote the hagiographies 2 centuries after his death added serpents to a story that contained none. Irish annals document druids operating in Ireland well into the 7th century. If Patrick drove them out, they came back. The 2 monks most responsible for the Patrick legend, Tirichan and Muirchew, wrote their accounts approximately 200 years after his death. The man himself wrote about his suffering, his uncertainty, and his fear. He described himself as uneducated and unworthy. Everything attached to his name after that was added by people who never met him. New Year's. The Catholic Church tried harder to eliminate January 1st celebrations than any other pagan festival on the calendar. It failed. The calends of January honored Janus, the two-faced Roman god of beginnings. By 153 BCE, it had become the administrative start of the Roman year. Citizens exchanged gifts of honey, dates, and coins. The army renewed loyalty oaths. Processions moved through the streets. The festival was woven into the governmental apparatus of the empire, which made it nearly impossible to target without disrupting the structures built on top of it. The Council of Tours issued explicit decrees against the calends in 567 CE, prescribing fasting and liturgical offices to counter pagan celebration on that date. A separate council condemned the worship of Janus as ancient errors. The church eventually designated January 1st as the Feast of the Circumcision. It was a weak rebranding. The gift-giving, the toasts, the renewal rituals, and the feasting persisted across Europe throughout the medieval period in forms nearly identical to their Roman originals. At some point, the church appears to have quietly stopped trying. 1,000 years before Rome, the Babylonian New Year was marked differently. The king was stripped of his crown, brought before the statue of the god Marduk, and struck across the face by the high priest. He was required to kneel and confess his failures. His tears were considered a good omen for the year ahead. The king of the most powerful empire on earth was publicly humiliated as a condition of legitimate rule. Every year, without exception. If he did not weep, it was a bad omen, so he wept. The most powerful man alive cried in front of a priest once a year to keep his throne, and everyone agreed this was how it should work. Thanksgiving. Between 1616 and 1619, a disease moved through the Wampanoag homeland in present-day New England, most likely leptospirosis. Approximately 90% of the Wampanoag population died. Estimates place the death toll between 6,000 and 7,200 people in 3 years. By the time the Mayflower arrived in 1620, the land the Pilgrims settled had already been emptied. The man credited with helping the Pilgrims survive was called Tisquantum, known in English as Squanto. In 1614, English sea captain Thomas Hunt kidnapped approximately 25 Wampanoag people and sold them into slavery in Spain. A notarial deed dated October 22nd, 1614, found in the Malaga archives, documents the transaction. The seller's name, the buyer's name, the date, the number of people sold. Squanto's capture is paperwork. He eventually reached London, then Newfoundland, and then arrived home to find most of his people gone. The 1621 harvest gathering between the Pilgrims and Wampanoag leader Osamequin was a mutual defense negotiation as much as a celebration. The Wampanoag arrived with 90 warriors. Both parties needed the alliance. The epidemic had left the Wampanoag vulnerable to rival tribes, and the Pilgrims could not survive the winter without assistance. Abraham Lincoln declared Thanksgiving a national holiday on October 3, 1863, following the Union victory at Gettysburg. His proclamation was a political instrument for national unity, built on a version of events that had already been simplified beyond recognition. The holiday and the story used to justify it were formalized at the same time. The Wampanoag perspective was not included in either. Halloween. All Saints' Day was not always held on November 1st. Pope Gregory III moved it there in 731 CE, expanding it to honor all saints and martyrs. In 835 CE, Pope Gregory IV made it a mandatory holy day throughout the Frankish Empire, issuing a decree with the assent of all the bishops. In the following century, Abbot Odilo of Cluny established All Souls' Day on November 2nd. Within roughly 2 centuries, the church had built a 3-day religious window, October 31st, November 1st, November 2nd, placed directly on top of the Celtic seasonal festival already occupying that part of the calendar. Samhain was a Celtic harvest festival documented in 9th century Irish manuscripts. The mound of hostages at Tara is astronomically aligned to the Samhain sunrise. Whether it was specifically a festival of the dead is debated by historians. Ronald Hutton, one of the leading scholars of British pagan traditions, argues there is no medieval evidence for that characterization, and that the association with the dead may have been projected backwards from All Souls' Day centuries later. The bonfires, costumes, and divination practices attached to October 31st persisted in folk tradition despite 2 papal decrees. The church never fully replaced what it found there. It built on top of it. The darker qualities that define modern Halloween may not be ancient at all. They may be medieval Catholic, absorbed back into popular culture until no one could tell where they came from. Christmas. The story most people have heard their whole lives, that the church took December 25th from a Roman pagan festival. appears to be wrong. 3rd century Christian scholars Hippolytus of Rome and Julius Africanus both independently calculated December 25th as the birth of Jesus, working backwards from the belief that the Annunciation fell on March 25th. The first documented Roman celebration of Sol Invictus on December 25th does not appear in the historical record until 354 CE. Christians had been using the date for over a century before that. The pagans may have been responding to the Christians, not the reverse. The story most people grew up with is not slightly wrong, it is backwards. What the church did absorb were the customs. Saturnalia, the Roman festival running through late December, involved gift-giving, decorated evergreen branches, candles, feasting, and 1 week each year in which masters served their enslaved people at table. These traditions were embedded too deeply to remove. Pope Gregory I understood this. Around 600 CE, he wrote to Augustine of Canterbury and explicitly instructed him not to destroy pagan temples, but to repurpose them. His reasoning preserved in the historical record: people accept change more readily when they do not lose everything at once. The customs of Saturnalia were never banned. They were absorbed and renamed until they became indistinguishable from the holiday built on top of them. Easter. The English word Easter comes from a Germanic goddess. Her name is Eostre. She is mentioned exactly once in all of human history, in a single sentence written by the monk Bede in 731 CE. He recorded that the month was once named after a goddess in whose honor feasts were celebrated. That is the complete historical record. No pagan sources mention her, no temples, no inscriptions bearing her name. In 1958, over 150 votive inscriptions to a spring goddess called the Matronae Austria Henia were discovered near Morkenhof in Germany, dated to the 2nd century CE. The linguistic root connecting these inscriptions to the Old English Eostre is the word ostro, meaning rise or shine, connected to dawn. A spring goddess cult existed. Whether it was the same figure Bede recorded and how widely she was worshipped remains unknown. The Council of Nicaea set Easter's date in 325 CE. The motivation was not to suppress a goddess, but to separate the Christian celebration from Jewish Passover. Constantine wanted Christianity to operate as a distinct institution. The eggs and the hare are pre-Christian symbols of spring renewal documented across multiple cultures. They merged into Easter through centuries of folk practice rather than any single church decision. The popular claim that Easter derives its name from the Mesopotamian goddess Ishtar is false. Different language family, different continent, different etymology entirely. It spread primarily through a social media post in 2012 and has been corrected by historians. The accurate version is stranger and harder to verify, which may be why the invented version proved more durable. Beltane. Beltane was a Celtic fire festival celebrated on May 1st, marking the beginning of summer. Its name derives from the Celtic god Belinus and the Old Irish word for fire. Livestock were driven between two bonfires for ritual purification. Young people leapt over the flames. The ceremony centered on the May Queen, a symbolic figure representing the awakening earth, and the Green Man representing the returning sun. Their ritual union was understood as the mechanism of renewal for the growing season ahead. The Catholic Church replaced the central figure. The crowning of Mary, a Catholic ritual still practiced today, places a crown of flowers on a statue of the Virgin Mary on May 1st, led by a procession of young people accompanied by singing. The ceremony is the same, only the figure receiving the crown changed. In 1644, the English Parliament under Puritan control banned maypoles and all May Day celebrations, viewing them as pagan remnants incompatible with Christian morality. Maypoles were torn down across England. Communities hid sections of them until the ban could be reversed. When the monarchy was restored in 1660, the poles went back up within days. Then in 1889, the Paris Congress of the Second International declared May 1st as International Workers' Day, in solidarity with the Haymarket Affair martyrs of 1886. The same date had now been claimed by a Celtic fire festival, the Catholic Church, the Puritans, and the International Labour Movement. 3 of those 4 eventually lost the date. The Labour movement kept it. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe to History After Class and drop a like and comment down below.